Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. I was going to introduce Dark Matter Labs, but I think you've already done a very good introduction and even explaining what that dark matter means. But I will also try and give a little bit more details to what we do at Dark Matter Labs. And also from here on, I'll try to refer to Dark Matter Labs as DM for short, because Dark Matter Labs is a very long name. So DM, we often kind of, as a shorthand, use DM for to refer to ourselves. Okay, so DM is a strategic design and innovation lab. It currently operates in the UK and the Netherlands and South Korea and Canada and Sweden. So these are the countries that we have entities in, like legal entities. But we're also made up of around 70 people who work across the world remotely. So I'm one of those 70 people, but I'm based in Seoul, South Korea. And to sum up our mission in one sentence, I would say that we're an organization working towards building alternative pathways and options for our social and economic systems. And we recognize that a lot of the interconnected and compounding crises that we're seeing in the world today, like the climate crisis and others, are symptoms of a miscoding of our systems. And because these codes are often invisible and so deeply ingrained in our institutions and regulatory systems, we call them the dark matter, something that exists and carries weight, but is invisible to us. But while they're invisible, these codes still shape the norms and the behaviors and institutional logics, and they reflect how we value and how we govern and make decisions and how we organize and act or not act. And they fundamentally shape the societies we live in. And at DM, we work towards trying to locate where these codes are misaligned, and we try to recode them to imagine a different kind of system. And we are a very fast evolving organization. And we started off as a 5-person experiment in London around 2016. And now in 2024, we've grown to a team of 70. And so our mission and practice is also constantly evolving. And when this sketch on the left was made, I think it was around 5 or 6 years ago, our practice was mostly involved in designing and provoking new narratives, similar to what you might think a think tank would do. But in 2024, if you look at what we do, and we recently launched a new website, very recently. So if you look at what we do now, it's a lot more multidimensional. We do everything from developing digital platforms and tools to designing financial and policy instruments to seeding and demonstrating change on the ground. So what is our theory of change? We begin from a deep system analysis to try and identify where the intervention or leverage points are. And we try to communicate new possibilities through thought-provoking narratives and prototypes. And then we try to activate these possibilities through real-world demonstrators and testing the interaction between the shifts and the innovations that we're building and how it interacts and responds inside the real context. And we do this by deliberately working out loud in the spirit of open source. So a lot of the things that we build, even writing and writings and platforms, they are available open source, and anyone can fork and iterate and publish their own. So in this spirit of open source, we try to converse with the wider community to constantly refine and iterate our own ideas, as well as building legitimacy in conversation with the larger world. And finally, compounding learning is hugely important because it's a process that allows us to continually evolve by responding to new possibilities and realities that emerge along the way, because the world is constantly changing. So I'll give a few examples of the kind of projects that we do at DM. So one area of work that we do is about building what we call system demonstrators, which are cross-lever initiatives that combine different types of innovation across different areas like civic participation, regulation, finance, data governance, and how these can unlock systemic transition pathways. And these are built and demonstrated live in actual places together with local actors. Because we're just a team of 70 people, we can't do everything. And we want our work to be rooted in real context. We always work with other actors, often actors that are anchored in physical context. And one example of this kind of work, I'm sorry about the video being unavailable, but it's not important. One example of this kind of work is called Trees AI, and which is short for Trees as Infrastructure. And this project, it started with a question: can we see trees as an urban nature as a critical part of urban infrastructure, like the way roads and bridges and railways are? And because in local governments currently in many different cities, trees are actually seen as costs to maintain. They cost money to maintain. But if we're able to capture and account for all the benefits that trees can bring to mitigate climate risks or air pollution and even mental health, they can be actually seen as assets, producing long-term benefits. And if they're seen as assets, this will allow us to invest much more in trees and not just see them as costs. So the earlier phase of this project was funded through the Google Impact Challenge. And now we're working with different cities such as Seoul and Stuttgart. Before we used to work with Glasgow in Scotland to demonstrate in specific contexts. So this is a tool we built as part of the demonstrator in Stuttgart in Germany, and it's called the location-based scoring. So we worked with the municipality of Stuttgart to identify the key risks that the city faces, such as heat risk on population health, drought risk on green infrastructure, and air pollution and flooding risks, these kind of risks that any city might be exposed to. And then this tool then helps cities to identify areas vulnerable to climate risks. And by analyzing the risk profile of each location, we can guide the design of nature-based solutions in the city. For instance, planting certain kind of trees to reduce flooding risks in a particular area. So Trees AI as a system demonstrator, it touches upon various types of innovation, such as policy design, data, and finance, because it's about how do we turn trees into assets. So it is about financial innovation. And it also helps to build the capabilities in cities to respond to long-term risks. I'll give another example. This example is the community retrofit project, which is being done in the UK, and namely in Birmingham and Edinburgh. And I'm not sure whether retrofitting is a commonly used term in Japan, but It refers to the process of upgrading existing buildings or infrastructure to improve their performance, often in terms of energy efficiency and sustainability. Because building-related emissions, they make up more than a third of total emissions in Europe, and Europe has a lot of old buildings. Retrofitting is considered a very critical intervention to meet the emission goals, like the Europe's goal towards net zero. So under the umbrella of something called the neighborhood retrofit, we're building an early stage neighborhood level energy collective model that can be scaled into a citywide retrofit program. So it can start in a neighborhood scale, but a city is made up of multiple neighborhoods, so it can become a city scale program. And as a system demonstrator, this model consists of different types of innovations, ranging from new types of governance and funding mechanisms, like certain kinds of participatory budgeting, and also a new kind of a model of governance called the neighborhood transition entities, to new types of contracts that are based on a building's performance, like energy efficiency. And also tied to that contract, there's something called a digital material registry that logs all the materials used in a building, like everything from the glass in the window, the steel frame of that window to bolts. And it also tracks where they came from and the provenance of these materials. And also when they have done their doing and they are replaced, where do they go? Like, are they going to be dumped somewhere, or are they going to be recycled? So it allows us to track a building's performance based on the parts that the building is made of, the materials. And this becomes part of a building's performance indicator, and throughout the whole lifetime of a building. And the second area of work is around facilitating what we call city transitions. And we see cities as strategic levers or points of transformational change around the world. And we're currently working with a number of cities to build demand and pathways for a large-scale transition. But rather than seeking to just control and deliver transition in a very top-down way, our work invites a range of institutions into roles as orchestrators of a multi-actor collaboration. And the role that we play in this is really to help the capacities in local governments to build and hold and coordinate portfolios around net zero goals. Or it doesn't have to be net zero. Sometimes it can be a different kind of mission. And one main project in this area of work is the Net Zero Cities Initiative, which is an EU-funded program. And it works with, I think, over 100 different cities around Europe. And they help the cities to align on common goals, commit to these goals via something called climate city contracts, and to test and scale initiatives through something like system demonstrators around particular innovation domains. So we are one of the organizations involved in a very big Net Zero Cities initiative. And a third area of work is around innovating deep codes, the dark matter of systems. And mainly these cover domains such as finance, law and regulation, contracting, and even metrics and measurement, and also governance. And we're interested in designing, for instance, new types of currencies, like an air quality currency, or contracts that can account for many-to-many relationships rather than one-to-one or one-to-many. And also designing new theories of governance and civic organizing. This project is called Circular, and it's a digital platform that we've been co-developing with the city of Amsterdam and also with a team of lawyers. And it helps policymakers navigate the existing regulatory system and identify the regulatory levers around circular economy. And at DM, we consider law and regulation as one of the critical deep codes. So when we think about impact through shifting law and regulation, we might think it's about changing regulation or enacting a new law. But circular isn't actually about creating new law. It's about changing the way we interact and engage with law. And after talking to city administrators and policymakers in Amsterdam, we realized that a lack of regulation on circular economy, that's not the biggest barrier. But the real barrier is the underutilization of existing regulation. So the circular platform turns law, which is usually very static and text-based and very boring, into something that can be searched and filtered and compared. And so basically introducing law as a service. This is a project that I'm currently holding at DM. So you can ask me more about it later. So Permissioning City, it's called. It's a collection of digital tools that support community-led, distributed urban governance. And this project started with a question: how can we think differently about who decides how we use the city? And for most cities, and for most of the 20th century, urban planners have been dividing the city into different areas with different uses and different functions from a very top-down perspective, right? And which is a very simplistic way of understanding a city. And at the level of the individual building or house, the property owner, the owner of that building or house, has almost all the control. So this has caused many issues, like including vacant buildings and also underutilized spaces, because there's a misalignment with the demand, the supply and the demand. So we tried to respond to this question of how can we decide how we use the city and its spaces in a more decentralized and democratic way. And we built something. Permissioning City is a suite of tools, and we built one of those tools, and it's called Permissioning Engine. The innovation around this is that it inverts, inverts the universal and top-down nature of rulemaking in the city, so that people who are actually using the space have a say and participate in the governance of that space. Governance meaning including making of the rules and also the decision-making around a particular space. So people are able to create new rules about the space and also the activities held in that space. But the important thing is that these rules can be negotiated and iterated. So they're not static rules, they're dynamic. And so with this platform, people can request permission to use a certain space, and they can adopt what we call rule templates, which are pre-approved by a community of space stewards, who are the caretakers of that space. Yeah, I won't go into too much details now, but I'll be happy to speak more about this when we have time during Q&A. So the final area of work is around organizational innovations. And this work explores and helps transform the way organizations operate. And traditional organizations, I think you might know, are very hierarchical and centralized. and they have these command and control structures. And these organizations will struggle to hold and respond to complex and fast evolving conditions. So in order to enable genuine systems change, the organizations as agents of that change and innovation, they need to evolve. And in a sense, Dark Matter Labs itself as an organization serves as a microcosm of the kind of future we envision, and we are constantly trying to experiment and iterate the way we operate as an organization. This is our org chart. It looks very different from a normal org chart. I think it represents not just the kind of organization we are, but also how we interpret what we do. And if you ask me where I am in this diagram as part of the organization, I think I'm probably one of the tiny atoms that make up one of the circles at the top. The diagram at the bottom, just the larger part with the text, is actually what we call org dev, which stands for organizational development, which are the supporting structures of our organization. So in another company, it would be things like HR or accounting or legal, that kind of stuff. So what's on top is where the projects and the experimentation happen, and where all the options and pathways are made. But in order to do that, we need to create entirely new kinds of organizations, infrastructures, and capabilities. So that's why we have this very big, elaborate bottom part. I hope I'm doing okay in terms of speed of speaking, but yeah. So in the next section, okay, thank you. In the next section, I'll introduce some key concepts on the portfolio approach, which is a kind of methodology that's been developed and currently being practiced among various organizations in the systems design, broadly the social and public innovation field. So portfolios, as a concept you might already have heard of, is much more widely used in finance as a risk management tool. And the idea is that you have a diverse collection of investments in different sectors. And when the economy hits certain sectors, but it boosts certain other sectors, you'll have like losses and gains, but in the end, it balances out and it helps reduce risks, right? That's the logic of the financial portfolio. But portfolios in the context of strategic innovation, it also encourages diversification. But this diversification is not just for risk management in case like some actions fail. The idea is similar in that actions or initiatives in a portfolio, they span across different sectors, for instance, like energy or transport or education. But what's important in a portfolio is to draw connections between these actions and see where the synergies are. So because the portfolio method was developed in response to critiques on siloed action plans, that the actions are very isolated in nature and they don't speak to each other. The crucial aspect in a portfolio is to coordinate these actions together and also see how by coordinating them together, can we share resources or bring opportunities for collaboration between actors that might not have like obvious overlaps. So what's the context behind this shift towards portfolios? Why did organizations like UNDP and EU decide to explore these new approaches? I'll give three of the many reasons. The first is a realization that the pace and scale of the actions that come out of existing approaches are nowhere near sufficient to be able to solve the challenges we face, like the climate crisis. For instance, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, which is almost 10 years ago, neither the emission trends nor commitments by countries are in line with any of the agreed targets. And the second reason is that our governance processes and structures are just not evolving fast enough to address the increasing uncertainty and complexity of these wicked problems like climate crisis. So we have very ambitious targets, but we lack the governance capacity to organize and coordinate actions to implement them. And the third reason is that the actions that come out of existing approaches, they don't deliver long-term systemic impact. Their scope is often very narrow. They also lack legitimacy, so often it gets opposed by the public. And they also tend to be short-term because they're influenced by the short-term nature of political cycles. So how is a portfolio approach different from existing approaches? I thought we could compare portfolios with pilots in the sense that both of these approaches were developed with the aim of delivering impactful change and are often used with the intention to test and experiment and apply to large-scale developments. So pilot projects, they are initiated to test how well a solution works before we implement something bigger in scale, right? And in a portfolio approach, we're more interested in testing how the system responds to this new innovation that's introduced into the system. Because the ultimate objective is to move the system rather than just creating a very beautiful exception that that fails to integrate into the system. And when testing, pilot projects often test a single solution because they want to test whether it works with minimal costs. But portfolio testing involves testing always a combination of actions because we want to bring out their compound impact. We want to see how different actions work together. And a pilot test wants to figure out how the solution can be implemented through, what kind of processes. And it assumes that after this pilot is successful, they can replicate the same process and outcomes, but just on a bigger scale. So it works with predictable processes and outcomes. A portfolio, on the other hand, assumes that the system is fluid and uncertain. So it requires dynamic processes and responsiveness. And this is why we test how the system responds to what we are introducing. And a pilot project is delivered usually by a single partner, especially if it's about testing a small-scale version of a much bigger project. A portfolio is always built on a broad coalition, and creating very intentional spaces for collaboration is one of the most important aspects. And lastly, a pilot project is evaluated at the end of the project often by a specific evaluating entity, but a portfolio is evaluated and iterated at multiple points in the process by different people. And this could be the organization managing the portfolio, but also different local stakeholders that we engage in the process at different stages. So portfolios, they're designed to move us beyond the limitations of traditional action plans or pilots. Instead of addressing challenges in their isolation, portfolios focus on co-creating and co-implementing a set of coordinated and interconnected actions that span the entire system needing change. And by taking a systemic approach, it also focuses on uncovering and tackling the root causes of problems, rather than just addressing like surface level symptoms. And also the focus on learning and identifying synergies between actions. Portfolios aim to help us move from a very kind of fragmented landscape of efforts to systemic change. Okay, so what makes up a portfolio? How do you make them? This is where I think we can see why portfolios are fundamentally different from action plans or pilots. Because the what of a portfolio, the specific interventions or actions, they are only one aspect of the whole. And in portfolio making, it's equally important to create the conditions, the why and how. Because if a portfolio fails to continue for long term, it has failed. A portfolio is built around these interconnected interventions that represent diverse options within a system. It's driven and sustained and evolved by a network of autonomous but aligned actors. It's also composed of the key kind of capabilities and assets, such as funding or skills, and the kind of regulatory conditions that provide the foundation for that work. And also at the core of the portfolio is the intent, which is a mission rooted in shared values that not only guide the portfolio's direction, but also create a basis for connection. And finally, governance is what ties everything together. The portfolio also needs governance structure in order to orchestrate the actions and the actors and the assets. Yeah. So together, these elements create a dynamic system, not just a static plan. And I'll give you an example through a case study. The case study is about a real project that we did together with UNDP quite recently this year. And it's focusing on the air quality issue in a city called Almaty in Kazakhstan. Okay, so adopting a portfolio approach can look very different according to the different contexts. And portfolio approaches are being used also in different scales, like sometimes on a city scale, sometimes on a national scale, or even a continental scale, like Europe. And the wider project context it also matters a lot, like what are the ambitions of the funder and the context in which portfolios are being introduced. And in our Almaty project with UNDP, the portfolio was being made on a city scale, the city of Almaty, with particular attention to engaging local actors already involved in actions on air pollution, and also embedding it in key existing plans by the local government. So these conditions shaped our starting point and also the kind of connections we tried to build through the portfolio. So this is I guess, a tailored process that we designed for the project. It began with something called deep listening. Often this consists of desk research and a lot of interviews, stakeholder interviews, to understand the challenges, both academically and also from experiences on the ground. And in a portfolio approach, when we investigate the challenge space, we try to emphasize root causes and the underlying challenges. And understanding challenges usually allows us to start to identify new strategic angles, like for instance, reframing the challenge of air pollution in a different way, which might help activate different kinds of solutions. And once we came up with a new framing of the issue, we began the process of designing solutions and actions with different local stakeholders, which is the portfolio options design part, and also partnership building. So the process of stakeholder engagement actually helps local actors see their role in the project, they see their role in the portfolio. So this already begins the partnership building part. And an important part of how we build partnerships is the intention towards cross-sector coalitions. And lastly, dynamic portfolio management. So once certain actions in a portfolio start to get implemented, we activate certain processes that help track of progress and continuous learning and iteration. So I'll try to describe each process with a little bit more detail. So this is one of the visualizations we created during the deep listening phase, where we try to map the underlying challenges around air pollution issue in Almaty. You probably can't see clearly in the slide. I don't know how big your screen is, but each element represents a specific challenge. And there are some connections drawn between them, and they're in lines. So through synthesis and validation, we also try to cluster the challenges according to the typology of the problem, like data, you can see here, data, politics, or capacity gaps, and urban infrastructure. How we usually do this is, because no map is complete from the beginning, we create an initial version, which is a partial map. Some parts are empty deliberately. And this map, the partial map, is created based on the research we do and interviews we do. And then we use this partial map as a workshop tool to validate and add more input, depending on the kind of people we bring into that workshop. And you can also take it further and not just stop at the challenge mapping, but you can also map a landscape of existing initiatives already happening in the city, and also maybe go a bit further, even mapping potential initiatives that respond to some of the challenges you faced. And to make sure that we're not just getting the challenges on a surface level, but really getting to the root causes of the challenges. We sometimes do a 5 whys exercise. Maybe you've heard of this before. This is an example of that, where we started with one of the challenges. Just we took one of the challenge from the map. Let's say I think it says low activity of society in addressing environmental issues. And we asked people to think about why that is. And one of the answers said it's because air pollution is seasonal, and people are only aware of it when it becomes worse in certain seasons, and they forget about it when the season passes. So we ask another why. Why is that? People perceive it as seasonal because they are relying on what they feel and see, even though actually air pollution affects all seasons. And why is that? Because there's a lack of data, a lack of studies about air pollution on local levels, and it's not communicated to the public. So they have no choice but to rely on what they see and smell and sense. And why is that? Why is there lack of data and studies? Because there's a lack of a common strategy or vision that allows funding for research and efforts in public education. And why is that? Because the government doesn't see it as a priority, and there's no institutional coordination or commitment. And this goes on. You can go on forever. But at the end of the exercise, we made sure that we are making the root causes visible. And what's interesting is that when we do this exercise, often we start with a few challenges, and then it just expands because there are sometimes multiple reasons for a single problem. But then as you go deeper into the root level, they tend to become fewer. It means like a handful of core challenges produce ripple effects and produces multiple problems. It also means that addressing these root challenges means being able to influence other issues arising from that. So these are what we call levers. So the 5 whys exercise is one way to get to the root causes. Another method we often use, but we didn't do it in the Almaty project, is called system mapping. These are some images from another project we did also with UNDP, but in Bhutan. And the project was centered around investigating the challenge of youth unemployment in Bhutan during COVID. So in this system mapping phase, we took the qualitative data collected by UNDP to start to draw the connections between these challenges identified, really looking for the causal connections between different challenges and the symptoms identified. It's a very similar process, but maybe on a bigger scale, because it is still about identifying how problems are connected to each other causally. So in system mapping, the mapping of the challenges is followed by a process of analysis and synthesis. And the mapping itself, the exercise of mapping, really allows us to expand the problem space and even see challenges that we didn't necessarily saw as connected to, let's say, air pollution or youth unemployment. And the process of connecting these challenges to each other helps us to see the interdependence of the different issues and also analyze how they are related causally. And the causal links, as I said before, are quite important because this becomes the basis of identifying where are the leverage points. And then this is followed by a stage of synthesis, where we try to identify the patterns and the clusters that emerge from these connections. And then we can begin to start to create a narrative. And in each part of this step, we hold a lot of participatory workshops where we're constantly validating and with different people and iterating based on their feedback. And in the Bhutan project, what is interesting is we also it was the first time we used some network analysis tools like Kumu. I don't know if you've heard of Kumu or Graph Commons. So we ran the connected elements. So each challenge was an element, and we connected them, and we ran it through kind of a network analysis tool to see what the kind of clusters the machine would generate for us. But it was an experiment. I think we just treated it as one particular perspective of the system, which was done by the machine, but humans were involved in kind of validating what was being generated. And this was our final output. This is the system map, and it looks very complex. So no one wants to read it probably. So it was always accompanied by some narrative cards. We made some cards which guided people in reading the map. Yeah. And if you see these highlights, the lines, each of them is a cluster actually, and each of them will form a narrative. So you can begin by maybe choosing a point in one of the lines to start to read the map. And visualizations at DM, they're not just an output, but for us it's a very critical part of the process of evolving our thinking and also explaining the logic, and also a tool that we use to engage stakeholders in the co-creation process. So going back to the Almaty project, One critical aspect of portfolio making is the effort to set the stage for both likely and unlikely actors to collaborate. And in the Almaty project, we held 3 main collaborative sessions, design sessions, and also many meetings in between. And we invited different actors like architects, urban designers, university students, people from academia, civil servants, and even like startup communities. And we had to always we selected representatives and we brought them together in one room. And these sessions helped to validate our analysis and also help gather input from them at the same time. So we spent about 3 months holding these sessions, progressing from challenge mapping to building what we call a portfolio of options. And there's always a point in when you kind of transition from a challenges phase where you have connected all the challenges, and these interconnected challenges start to appear as like entry points for new options, like new solutions and possibilities to emerge. We continue to try and identify where the synergies and connections could be between these ideas. And then we also try to categorize them to understand their relevance and also help stakeholders, ideate better. And what you see in this slide are the 3 entry points we ended up creating. So one is governance, one is around knowledge, and one is around regulation. This was obviously informed by the challenges mapping, because a lot of the root causes, they tend to be around governance, regulation, and knowledge. So we use these as kind of entry points and also kind of placeholder classification, where it would allow people to think about what are the possibilities or potential actions that could help solve the challenges. So we identified the challenges and then we ideated new actions based on these challenges. But what are these actions building up towards? What are the strategic goals of the portfolio? And defining the intent and mission of the portfolio is very important. And this also has to be done through a social and participatory process, because, especially if you don't want to recreate the top-down action plan. And critically, in the Almaty project, what the challenge mapping allowed us to do was to understand that air pollution, because in Kazakhstan, was mainly considered as an environmental issue. It was never considered a priority for the local government compared to issues like economic growth. And this was fundamentally a barrier. So the local actors who engaged and who participated in the process told us that they thought the most significant contribution of the portfolio process was that we were able to make a new argument that reframes the problem of air pollution from an environmental issue to a health and economic issue. Because if air pollution was to be considered an economic issue or public issue, like pandemic, people would start to pay attention. And there are actually a lot of research that proves the correlation between air pollution and economic productivity, for instance, and not to mention the public health costs of air pollution. But the barrier was that because the localized research in this field was underfunded, and these arguments risked getting dismissed because without the local data, you can't back up these arguments. People would say, we would say there's research done in London proving the correlation between economic productivity and air pollution. But they'll just say, but what about in Almaty? Like, it doesn't mean it's the same here. So in order to make a better argument, it needs to be backed by local data. But realizing that this reframing of the problem could help mobilize support because it will help prioritize the issue within the local government. It was a critical moment for this portfolio. And it was possible through these collaborative sessions with different stakeholders, where we explored the root causes together and also the potential options and the existing initiatives that could be leveraged. And at the same time, framing the issue as both a health and economic issue allowed us to bring entirely new actors who now had a stake in the problem, like parents and schools who care about children's health, or like local researchers who were already starting to do research on health impacts of air pollution in the city, but were not getting enough, attention. And this is an image of a public event we held that invited citizens and scientists in conversation. We also had a lot of meetings with the government, and this changed throughout the project. Initially, everyone told us to talk to the ecology department because air pollution was an environmental issue. But after this reframing and having socialized and communicated that sufficiently to the city, we reached out to different departments and we built partnership in the end, with the team in charge of urban infrastructure and development, rather than the ecology department. And this is a visual output we made that shows the connection between the intent of the portfolio, the entry points and the challenges and the options and the impact. And it also explains the logic of the portfolio as well as the process we took. And in the end, we came up with a short list of around 19 or 20 different options, which spoke to 3 different clusters. And I think these clusters reflect the intent and the reframing. So one cluster is around improving health with a focus on families and children. And one is around building a green economy. And then the third one is around green urban development. And the options under these clusters, they cover various levers like technology, governance, policy, and culture. So they're very kind of variated. Due to probably time limits, I can't go into the details about the implementation of the portfolio. And also because at DM, we finished our contract with UNDP around May this year, and then the implementation phase, the activation of the portfolio, is now being carried on by the local stakeholders. So we've kind of stepped away from this project now. But before we left, we designed this together. And this is where we come back to the system demonstrators as a concept, which combines a handful of different but synergistic interventions. And in the Almaty project, after we created a portfolio of options, we worked with the local government to put together a more kind of focused, nested portfolio. So like a portfolio within a portfolio. And it's called Safe Green Streets. And Safe Green Streets has policy innovations like low emission zoning. It also has street redesign and also more like small scale tactical urbanism experiments that engage schools, and also street scale retrofitting, because retrofitting was important because one of the big emissions is related to how heating is done in buildings and the need for coal. And also nature-based solutions that help mitigate air pollution, because trees are also very good at filtering out some of the particles. So these very kind of diverse experiments because they're diverse in nature and not one actor can do it, it would need to involve diverse actors that can drive each part, right? And what a portfolio does is help build that alignment and the shared intent between actors. And that doesn't just begin from when they sign to I don't know, to do the implementation together. It happens well before, when we start to engage them in the design process. So it begins with a lot of research maybe and a lot of workshops, but it's all feeding into how we kind of to enable coalitions or collaboration between actors, and which is very critical for implementation. Okay, and lastly, going back to this diagram of the portfolio making process for Amati, I actually want to emphasize that the process, even though I've said it as a kind of linear sequence, so like starting with deep listening and then blah, 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 is actually not linear or sequential. Each part is happening everywhere all at once. And especially the learning and iteration, that doesn't just happen at the end. For instance, the list of actions and partners changed multiple times in the process. Like, right, we engaged the ecology department first, but we ended up working with the urban infrastructure department. It changed because of the inputs by stakeholders, and also in trying to align with certain strategic plans in a city. For instance, at that time in Almaty had just kind of published a new urban development plan, and it was very essential to try and align some of the actions that we were proposing to the intent of some of the things that they had in that report. But the important thing is that we don't see these changes as a disruption to the original plan, but it's more of a necessary adaptation that allows us to respond and react to the evolving system. Yeah, and speaking of adaptation, I think the methodology itself is constantly being iterated and adapted. So please consider what I presented as just one example of a portfolio approach, and each portfolio process will inevitably look very different. Yeah. Yes, this is all from me. I think we have some time for questions, so I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. ありがとうございます。Yeah, very good question. I think I mentioned this in the slide when I was comparing pilots with portfolios. I think with portfolios, we really don't do like evaluation at the end. And obviously, I think portfolios need its own kind of unique evaluation method to be designed. And there's probably not a very good example of that in my head at the moment. But I do want to just emphasize again that what is being evaluated could be different in a portfolio. And are we evaluating whether the actions that were activated through the portfolio process, were they creating, impact? There's also another element that we can, right? Yeah, there are multiple things that can be evaluated in a portfolio. Maybe one very critical thing is what is the impact of the actions that were implemented through the portfolio. And I don't think currently there's a very good example of that. But just thinking of what could be a more unique metric for portfolios is because the intention is to create connections and synergies between the actions and getting unlikely actors to collaborate. I think we can design metrics that measure these things. For instance, how many actors who wouldn't have met and collaborated with did so because of a portfolio process. So the number of unlikely collaborations. And I think we can measure more qualitative things like the quality of collaboration and also the amount of investment attracted in a portfolio. Because portfolio is made up of very different actions and includes different actors. You cannot find one funder to, so it needs to attract multiple funders as well. Yeah, I think management or governance of a portfolio is one of the most difficult challenges. And it's a challenge. And I think because portfolio approach is rather new, and we are just kind of witnessing the first kind of big implementation efforts of portfolios. And so who manages a portfolio is a very big question. In the UNDP example, is it UNDP? But actually it kind of defeats the purpose of the portfolio to have one single organization managing the entire portfolio. So inevitably, in order to avoid that, like having one single organization, having centralized information and taking the lead, you need to constantly try and engage actors from the very beginning and multiple points in order for them to start to feel the ownership of the portfolio themselves. So ideally, these actors are acting with their own intents, but aligned on a higher level, on a meta level, but they act autonomously. So I think the ability to orchestrate, so UNDP's role as the kind of initiator of a portfolio is best placed when they are playing an orchestrator's role. Yeah, and creating clarity of the mission and intent so the actors can align under that umbrella and begin to move on their own. And I think that's I think that's reflective of systems change itself. So we are a non-profit organization, by the way. So yes. And so we get quite a lot of funding from grants, from philanthropies, for instance. Yes, and we also have partnerships with local governments. So we work directly sometimes with municipalities. So Circular is a good example where we are co-developing the platform together with the city of Amsterdam. Yeah, I think but by far the majority of our funding is grant-based at the moment. Yeah, 皆さんありがとうございます。